see. Sorry, just going to take me a minute here. I'm a little lost myself. Okay. We've got people coming in.
Excellent.
Wow, 99, 100.
Yes, we have over 200 attendees.
Whoa. Wow.
So we'll just wait a few more minutes. Yeah, not to freak you guys out or anything. So welcome everyone. So we'll get started in just a minute. I just want you all to know where we are. We're here for Conversations About Abstraction, 6 Black women abstract artists in Los Angeles. So we've got people still joining in, so we'll wait a couple more minutes before we get started. And then I will say a little bit about how the Zoom webinar works, and then we will jump right into the conversation. So welcome everyone. So yeah, people are still joining in. May take a few minutes. Welcome everyone. And if you're not familiar with a Zoom webinar, the only people that will be showing on your screen are the panelists. In a little while, I'm going to stop my video and it will just be the panelists and the moderators. You will have an opportunity to participate in questions and answers. So we'll wait a few more minutes till we have everyone join. It's really exciting for people to be joining all around the country and from a few different countries around the world. Yes, yes, definitely. So, yeah. So for those of you who are not familiar with Flux Art Space, it's a small artist-run project space in Long Beach, California. I'm the resident artist. The space is in the front of my studio in Long Beach. And during the pandemic, we're trying to keep art visible and we're trying to keep art opportunities available to as many people as possible. So this was an opportunity to try something new. This is actually our very first Zoom webinar, and what a great group of people to start off with. So, okay, let's see, what time is it? Okay, if we could wait just a couple more minutes, people are still signing in. And for those, for the panelists, I think you're aware there's a way to mute and unmute yourself. Hopefully you'll be muted or unmuted the whole time, but just in case, I think we've gone over most everything. So. Welcome everyone. If you're just signing in, we're gonna get started in just a minute. And we are recording this presentation so that hopefully we'll be able to make it available either in part or in whole later on for those who aren't able to sign in today, or if you'd like to see the conversation again. Okay. All right, one more minute, then we'll get started. One of the interesting things is to see, everybody connecting from their own private spaces, but we can still get together. I'm seeing a raised hand, so I'm going to check on that briefly. Okay.
Erica, can you help me, please? I can't figure out. No, they can't. No, I've muted it.
Okay. I think one of our panelists may not. Are you guys all doing okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to just get started. We will probably have a few more people sign in as we go. My name again is Betsy Laura Hall. I run a small artist-run project space in Long Beach called Flux Art Space. I'm really grateful to have all of these esteemed artists here today, and to talented curators all from the Los Angeles area to have a conversation about abstraction. And I want to let them do all of the talking, so I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Diane Wedgeworth. She was the first person that I reached out to host this conversation, and I'm really grateful that she's worked so hard to make this happen for everyone. So, Lisa?
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, everyone, for making time to be with us. We're really excited about this conversation. So I just wanted to start and share with you all and give you a bit of context about how this conversation started. In February of this year, I had a really great studio visit with Stephen Wong, who is a curator at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery. And as part of the process of being a COLA fellow, there are regular check-ins with the curator just to see how we're doing and to talk about the work. And during that studio visit, he asked a really potent question, and that was, what conversations am I having with Los Angeles-based Black women abstract artists? And I waited a moment for these wonderful memories to surface, and they didn't. And I realized that I hadn't had this conversation or these conversations outside of, you know, walking to your car after an opening with a friend talking about your practice, you know, in a very casual way. So the ladies that you see with today, the other 5 artists, I invited to have a private conversation where we could talk about anything and everything as it related to being Black women artists that were working in abstraction, specifically living in Los Angeles. And it was a really great conversation. I shared a few articles, we read through those, and I posted an image of our conversation on Instagram, and people started responding, sending me direct messages that they wanted to participate in this conversation as well, which was really exciting. And so Betsy reached out and wanted to host it. And so I went back to the women, and we knew that it was important that if we were going to have this public conversation, that we needed to invite curators who, critical thinkers, to be a part of this conversation, to moderate this conversation, not to just be here in place, but to really also be able to ground it and root it in art history. But it was also important for us to have people who we respected and who were involved in our lives and who respected us. And the first people that came to mind were Moniz and Isabelle Lutterodt, and also Mar Hollingsworth of CAM, but unfortunately she wasn't able to participate. So I thank all of the artists for continuing this conversation and for Isabelle and Jill joining us. And I will, perfect time to segue over to Jill Moniz.
So hi, everybody, welcome. Thank you, Lisa, for having me involved in this great conversation. Before we get started, the one thing that I just want to say is that it's so beautiful that there are so many Black women working in abstraction in Los Angeles to build community with, and I think that that's pretty remarkable. A lot of women art historically worked in isolation, so the fact that you guys have each other is wonderful, and I think really makes things better for all of us who get to witness your practice. So I want to introduce Isabelle Lutterodt. She's the director of the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery in Barnsdall Art Park in the city, for the city of Los Angeles, Department of Cultural Affairs. She holds an MFA in photography from California Institute of Arts, otherwise known as Cal Arts, in Valencia, California, just north of us. And she has an MA in Art, Museum, and Gallery Studies from the University of Leicester in Leicester, England, in the UK. Prior to moving to the UK, she curated as part of a collective MULE, M-U-L-E, exhibitions throughout Los Angeles, focused on cultural and community-based issues. So it is a pleasure, and certainly my pleasure, to call her a colleague and to do work with her in the city of Los Angeles. And I'm going to give it to Isabelle to open up our conversation.
Thank you, Jill. I want to first start by just welcoming everyone and all all 148 people who are listening in, along with this incredible group of women. Thank you, Lisa, for inviting me to join and be part of this discussion. And thanks to Flux Art Space for hosting. And thank you to the artists, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. I want to start by kind of, we're in this very interesting moment in history, and perhaps a lot of moments in history can be described that way. And this one is, but this one feels particularly salient because of where we are. We're at a place of resistance, we're at a place of revolution, discomfort, reckoning, negotiation, and all of us have additional words that we can add to this. And in the end, and all of this is, and all of this for many of us is in response to just being able to say Black Lives Matter. We all, there's a reckoning going on, and we can see changes are afoot as galleries rush to claim titles and make proclamations in support of different ideologies that kind of tie back to this particular moment that we're in. And so I wanted to, and there are lots of different conversations that are happening around us. And many of these ideas, as they relate to the words of revolution, resistance, discomfort, reckoning, are in the forefront of our minds. So it feels important to note that each of these women has worked so hard to get to this point, to be taken seriously as artists, to be included in exhibitions, to be represented by galleries, and et cetera. And they can add to that. They've worked incredibly hard to get to this point and make their work. Placing us in this moment, I wanted to start this conversation with the artists telling us how they are responding to this moment in their work.
Before we jump into this conversation, though, let's just have each one of our artists introduce themselves so that everybody can know who's who. So Holly, why don't you start?
Right, I'm Holly Tempo. I'm located in Inglewood, California. I'm a painter and I do site-specific installation. Welcome, everybody.
Hi, it's Betsy again. Just briefly, for those of you who are just joining webinar, if you want to ask questions at any point, you can put them in the Q&A. And also, if you're new to Zoom, you may be able to toggle between speaker view and gallery view. So if you want to see everyone, you're going to want to have it on gallery view. And if you want to focus in on one individual speaker while they're speaking, you'll want it on speaker view. Thank you. That's it. Sorry.
That's it.
Thanks, Betsy.
I'm Lisa Diane Wedgeworth. I am a painter. I'm also a performance artist and video artist, and I have a studio in City Terrace, California. Native Angelino in the house.
June?
I'm June Edmonds. I'm a painter, and I am only a painter, and I'm based in, and I'm based in San Pedro at this point.
I'm Adrian Devine. I live and work in Pasadena, California. I'm a mixed media artist. I have been making art for over 30 years, but only exhibiting publicly for about 10 years now.
Hi, I'm
Sharon?
Sharon Barnes, and I work in painting and a little sculpture, mostly mixed media, and been working for a long time. Let's just leave it there.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Oh, so sorry. I'm Adrian Culverson. I'm in Los Angeles, and I make work that is a combination of painting, sculpture, and some photography.
All right, so Isabelle, do you want to sort of rephrase?
Yeah, thank you, Jill. Yeah, so maybe each of you, we can go around and you can kind of placing us in this moment in history and where we are right now. If you could talk about how you're responding to this moment in your work.
You want me to start?
Yeah, or Holly, go ahead. Yes.
So I'm going to back up into March when the pandemic hit and it was announced as a pandemic. So as many of you know, Lisa and I are both recipients of the COLA Master Artist Fellowship, and we're busy at work creating work for the show that was to be launched in May. And when the pandemic hit, I was making these very large paintings, and suddenly I felt like I couldn't breathe. And of course, that takes resonance when you jump forward to May and the situation with George Floyd, who literally couldn't breathe and was murdered by a police officer. So what I have found is that I had to find ways to breathe before I could consider painting. It literally took my breath away what was happening, was unable to work for almost a month. Started doing meditation, Tai Chi and things online. That helped quite a bit. Got my breath back, started working, and like everyone else, also just trying to survive. As far as response, I feel like there's a huge responsibility being a COLA artist, first of all, just to fulfill the requirements of the grant, but also as one of the very few Black women artists to have been selected for the grant. Felt a huge responsibility to keep working. And then also because of the times we're in, I felt like these are big paintings. They're dealing with situational issues in my community, cultural issues, geographic issues, through the filter of abstraction, and that they should be epic because the times call for that. So that's where I've been at this particular stage. I've finished the painting and I'm sort of regrouping and thinking about what's next, but that's where I've been.
I would say for me, my response has been both in my work and how I work. And like Holly, I too found myself kind of frozen in space. But what I started doing is creating an environment that's more therapeutic. So I have a little workstation that I've set up outside to work. Because I find, being out in nature is therapeutic. And then inside my studio, I'm reorganizing it so that it will support me being more focused in my work. I am also more mindful about the music that I listen to. I am more purposeful about my own self-care in order to protect my psyche and just guard my own creativity. And then what I found in my work, which I recently was able to actually get back into, I'm working on a painting right now. And typically my work is very layered. It's layered both physically through the processes I use. It's layered physically in like physical layers of how I apply. I'm speaking about painting in particular, just how I work. And then it's also layered conceptually. And what I found also is that there's now, and what has emerged for me and a piece I'm working on now is an added layer that is related to genocide and how genocide in its different forms and ways that's perpetrated. The other thing that I found, that's probably the most direct response to what's going on right now that's actually in my work. But the other thing that I found is that I've kind of doubled down on the spiritual and cultural frameworks, I guess I would say, that really drive what I do as an artist. And so those things are really are those that that kind of stand out to me, that are directly affected or direct outcomes of what's going on.
I'll go next. When the pandemic hit, I was shut out of my studio like a lot of artists were. And so even if I was of the mind to work, it was going to be a challenge to continue things that I had started midstream and couldn't finish, you know. But like Holly, I was kind of paralyzed for a good while. Just feeling everything that was going on was a big obstacle to my mental state and my spiritual state. But I do something that has been a good practice for me, and that's talk to my ancestors. And I asked them, well, what would you do, you know? And I know what they would do, because the reason I'm here is because they found ways to make things happen. And so I started working on my patio, and I couldn't do much, but I could do smaller works. And one day it started to rain, and I thought, wow, okay, so part of this painting is going to be rain and dust. So, and I kind of actually like that. And then a little later, I was able to rent a space and get back to work on one of the large scale paintings. And the topic of the painting, because usually my paintings have a topic even though they're abstract, was from a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks. And she said, live. She gave an exhortation to live. The time is cracked like a furious flower, and to bloom in the noise and the whip of the whirlwind. And it seems so fitting for this time. And the painting came out of that. And there's a central motif in it that's like a pregnant seed. And it really spoke to what I'm feeling about this time.
June, that sort of relates in a lot of ways to most of you all work in all of you work in abstraction, but most of you also have very specific narrative components to your work and to your practice in general. And so that feels very much like the work that June does in her work all the time. And maybe, June, you could talk about if there's been a shift for you specifically.
Yeah, you know, the inspiration of that work has always been rooted in history, you know, and very specific historical periods. And so now that has changed, you know, the historical periods where people were putting their lives on the line to move us, to catapult us forward, like, you know, time of Reconstruction and that kind of thing. So this time, in my opinion, is matching that in energy and in sacrifice, if you will. So that admiration, you know, for those historical figures is equal to my admiration to those that are putting their lives on the line, that are doing the protests, you know, in all the cities throughout the world. But also, I find myself responding to, if you want to call them microaggressions, they don't feel micro. And when the pandemic first occurred, you know, I work full time. So for a moment, you know, I felt very relieved to not have to be somewhere full time. So there's that aspect as well. And then after I got over that in a few days, you know, and knew that I had to put everything together online, which was more work that, you know, instructors and educators can attest to that, then you do find yourself in this role of healer, you know, to these young people that have had their lives as they know it taken away from them. So a lot of energy was put into that. And with all that energy that I needed to put into that, my studio energy did become sporadic. But by the time of the public lynching with George Floyd, and then the responses, sort of that's when this anger that I would experience on occasion, because of whatever circumstances in my life, this anger just came and sort of rested on me. And so I was sort of finished with work. So it was sort of the first time I was able to sort of be in the studio and sort of process through that anger. And it ended up in my painting.
Lisa?
Yeah, well, for me, I, like Holly, was in the depths of working on my COLA project and teaching at two classes at two different community colleges. So my focus was really about completing that work and trying to stay healthy and sane all at the same time, wanting and needing at some moments to really take some time off, but not being able to because I'm teaching several days a week and having to produce work. And as Holly said, there are extra requirements, and not anything negative, and there's no complaint about that, but that we had to make videos and do other things. So I think my first thought is that I'm not really necessarily producing work that's not necessarily about this time. And what I mean is that, there are several shows that have popped up across the United States about artists making work during COVID and coronavirus work or whatever, however they're phrased. And I don't respond, I'm not responding to it in that way. I don't have a natural inclination to make work specifically about COVID or even at the moment some feelings of isolation, but it was really about completing the work that I was doing. At the same time, there was once that was completed, I think a natural response for me to really take care of myself. And I knew that was important so I could continue working. So there was taking a lot of time to be at home and be me. And actually I took some time off away from the studio. I'm in a location where there are other people that are there as well. So it was really about taking care of myself. And it's funny, I kind of thought Sharon was gonna go someplace else when she said she was working on her patio. I was like, me too, but I'm redecorating mine. But that's all part of the healing, right? Like, I'm like, okay, I need to expand my living outdoors on my patio and fix it up. And so I'm repotting plants and, doing these other things, but it's all about it's still a part of my life and this extension of what I'm doing, But I think that's really the focus. I have not produced any work that is specific about this moment, but it was really about completing that work and healing and being at a place where I could continue working, which I'm, a few months have passed, but it feels like a year. Like it really does feel like a long time. My days have really blended together. There are days where I thought it was a Saturday and it was Wednesday, And really I've talked to people and I'm like, yeah, well, tomorrow on Sunday, and they're like, tomorrow's Thursday. And it's just like, really taking time so I can now get back to work. Yeah.
Adrian, we haven't heard from you.
Of course. Most of my work, the inspiration comes from talking to people. So when the pandemic happened, not being able to talk to people, I'm an instructor, I teach 2 beginning drawing classes, and like not having my students, that was really hard. I felt like even the interactions that you have going to the grocery store or shopping, just like a loss of contact from people. That has definitely changed the way I work. I have not been going to my studio as much. I've been drawing more. I am hopeful. The protests have definitely given me hope, I think, for the future to see some sort of a change, to hope that real change can actually happen.
Yeah, and Adrian and I are in the Adrian I was gonna say below me, but I don't know how you guys are seeing each other. But yeah, the one who's waving just spoke are in the same building, right? And I have not seen her at all. You probably haven't seen her because I've been home, right?
But I want to talk a little bit about this anger that June said that she was feeling, because I feel that, you know, as Black women, we've borne so much of the frustration of our communities and held people up and made space for people. And, you know, in the sense that we are seen in a lot of ways as, you know, these entities, sometimes just even vessels that just continue to give and bear and, you know, accept and do all of this work. And yet, you know, there's also that trope of the angry Black woman.
Mm-hmm.
And now it seems that there is a reckoning, you know, where people are getting called out on social media for, you know, these micro and macro aggressions. And I wonder if any of you are fearing these kinds of things that are happening, watching other artists that we all know be very specific in their calling out of these instances, and what that might look like long term for when we start to emerge one way or another from both the pandemic and from the moment of revolution. Revolutions tend to, insurgencies tend to be long, revolutions not so much. Are you thinking about the ways that you are interacting in the art world with each other in your communities? And are you thinking about that forward thinking down the road, what you hope to emerge into, the world you can help participate in or build as you go forward? And Isabelle, I think that question, I want to hear your thoughts on that as well, particularly as someone who is always making space for people in the work that you do.
Yeah, you know, I think we're I know that right now is a time to, I know there's a rush to like do things. And what I appreciate about what all of you have said as artists is this is a moment to maybe be for us to be within ourselves quiet. It's a time for everyone else to really do that work. But for us, it's a moment to come to a place of peace. And so the way that I have positioned, and it's not me, the way that the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery has positioned itself is, what are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves at this moment? And then what are the questions that we continually need to be asking? And I wonder, because those are the questions that will allow for a deeper conversation beyond that surface layer, and it allows us to be able to validate the anger and validate where we're coming from, and to see those microaggressions for exactly what they are, and not to cover it up or to discount it. I feel one of the things the burden is not there's so much happening that it feels like it feels important to be able to say that the burden of this moment is not on the Black body, and it's not on the Black personhood, it's not on the Black woman, because we're in a different place. And so I think that's where, in looking at the work, June, that you create, and thinking of the work that you created for COLA 2018, and thinking of the work that you created, Lisa, for the COLA 2019, and looking at the work, and thinking of Blackness and how you're positioning it. I think that feels like it's so right on par with the moment, that with where we are in this moment as Black women. And to be able, and what I appreciate by hearing about and listening to all of you is that is really the being okay with being in that moment and not feeling the need to rush to something. I think that it's so important to hear that validated in each of you.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because, you know, when I responded and said that I'm not making work about this moment, I'm in this moment. So my work is about me. It's autobiographical. So I'm going to continue making the work that I make that is about me, that are memories that surface, that are important for me to tell. My work with all of the mark making and all that I do deals with psychological and emotional energies. So it is about this time, but it's not about this time, if you know what I mean when I say that, right? Mm-hmm. It's about me in this moment, but I don't refer to it as coronavirus art or COVID-19 art, right? And I'll never refer to my art that way. Whatever moment I'm in and I'm making, it is about that time, because it's about me and how I move and navigate in that space, as well as whatever the observations that I'm making. You know, as my earlier work was more about historical events and communal memory, because we're all experiencing some of the narratives that I was interpreting and reimagining in my work. It's the same that's happening with the autobiographical work that's happening at this time, you know?
Yeah, I thought about, I would respond to the question kind of on two levels. One, you know, when you see sequences of death at the hand of police over and over and again, you have to go through this grieving process every single time, and it's hard, and it stops you in your track for a while, because you know, and for me, had to have lived as many decades as I have, and so I've seen a lot of death. I've seen a lot of people killed. I've seen a lot of people beat, hung, everything, you know. I've seen it all from in the decades that I've been on this earth. And you have to work past the grief, the anger, and the disappointment of, are things changing? Can I be hopeful, or will I just be disappointed again? These are real things that we have to work through as Black people. And for Black artists, we're sensitive to those things if we draw upon them in our work, like many of us do. Excuse me. And so, you know, when I think about abstraction, and I think about the decades and decades of Black people who worked in abstraction with this invisibility, and in our own careers, these women who are sitting here, honored to be, you know, sitting with, to look at the decades they worked invisible is a tragedy. I mean, all of these women here have phenomenal work, and we work with this invisibility, and still we work, and still we hope, and still we believe in ourselves, and we don't stop. But, you know, so on those two levels, I would respond to that question, both as Black people and as Black artists. It's like a double level of ways that I addressed that question.
I'd like to add some ideas about, I was thinking about Blackout Tuesday. So during this whole thing, I've been on social media way more than I normally am. I think before the pandemic hit, the last time I was on Instagram was sometime in the fall. And now I'm on it multiple times a day. I'm embarrassed to admit. And I remember the Blackout Tuesday. I don't remember what date that was. I guess it was sometime around not far after when George Floyd was murdered. And I understand that people thought they were doing something, that they were being allies, that they were, being in some way helpful. But the way I experienced it when I was scrolling through Instagram and seeing all these black squares, it felt like erasure.
Yeah.
It felt like being ignored again. And I know that's not the intention that was behind it. And what I was thinking about that more and realized that I think it's a flaw in our culture. And this is something that I notice, especially in Western culture, specifically America, and very well illustrated on Instagram, is that there's this level of superficiality that takes something that might be meaningful and maybe perhaps even revolutionary and makes it like a brand. So to me, the black square was not only nullifying, it also felt like a package, that it was a neat package that people could put on. You know, it's elegant black square. It makes me think of Ad Reinhardt paintings. You know, it was neat. It was easy. You could do that and say, hey, I'm down. I'm helping, you know, the people. But that's not at least how I experienced it. The other thing I've noticed on Instagram is there's a lot of, I'm calling it quote culture, where people just have pages and pages of these sort of quotes about, you know, relationships or, you know, how to make your life better or whatever. And I find that very odd. I don't know if it's because I'm a cynic, but it feels, again, too easy. It feels, you know, I get the sense that people are sort of trying to affirm something for themselves in their lives. They're doing it publicly, which is interesting, I find strange. And I'm not sure that it's working. So I think that there's a basic flaw. I'm going to go there and say, you know, capitalism, there's a flaw. You know, what our society, what our culture, what our country was founded on was the backs of slaves. And, you know, not only the murders of slaves, but also the indigenous people that occupied this land before any of us came. So there's this continued commodification of the black and brown body. And of course, being a woman, you know, we call it dual oppression, being black and female. And I feel like there has to be a triple oppression in there somewhere, just with, you know, the COVID and microaggressions and all of these things combined. So I guess I'm not sure if I'm saying anything particularly meaningful, except that I think that people who want to be allies need to go deeper and need to really think much more about what they're doing, and ultimately that talk is cheap and that actions speak louder than words. So one last example is I was reading about the Sierra Club, which I've admired. You know, I appreciate environmental efforts. I love nature. Just read that the Sierra Club has sort of publicly admitted that John Muir, who was the founder of the Sierra Club, was a racist. I had no idea. You know, he used very unpleasant language about people of color, about Native Americans, the indigenous people. Many of the early members of the Sierra Club were racist. And this is, we're talking early 20th century, so you can imagine, you know, Klan, John Birch, that kind of thing. And I realized looking back that it was about, you know, it's the idea is that we're preserving nature and, you know, that there's this sense of stewardship, but then you realize who are they preserving nature for? Not for people of color, and definitely not in communities of color. And you'll notice that if you look at environmental movements, that often is very lowly or very poor participation by people of color, and that people of color often have to do it themselves in their own community. So there's this kind of, to me, it relates to the notion of manifest destiny. I was thinking, you know, there's Theodore Roosevelt, there's John Muir, there's this idea of taming the West, taming the savages, you know, under the guise of environmental stewardship. And so I think we have to really dig deep, and I actually commend the Sierra Club for, you know, being honest and taking themselves to task, and we'll see, you know, how they handle it. But I would like to encourage others, whether individuals, organizations, corporations, to dig deep and talk as cheap people, do something.
I mean, but that's part of what is one of the problems of this moment, is this sort of performative work
Yes.
being done online, through various campaigns, or just, alliances, etc. Saying Black Lives Matter does not make you any more apt to do good things in communities of color at all. It just is an easy thing to say, but remarkably, it's been very hard for people to say. Like, we acknowledge that yes, Black lives do matter. So though that kind of performative social justice is happening around us, I think it's interesting, Holly, that you talk about action, because when we think about abstraction in particular, historically, art historically, the people who have been revered in abstraction have not been women of color, have not been communities of color that have been able to make a link between what they do in abstraction and what it means to the art historical canon, right? So, but you all have this really powerful work that you do in connecting cultural narratives as, cultural makers to this abstract work. And Isabelle and I were talking a lot about the idea that, abstraction does lead to revolution, right? That when you start being able to pull out ideas, central themes, shapes, form, all of these things that happen during abstraction, that you start to make this most salient aspects of what you see come to the forefront of your work. And so how can we use that, or how does the language that you create in your abstraction really serve this moment beyond performative justice, beyond thinking about abstraction as sort of in art historical terms, which I don't want to go down that rabbit hole in this conversation. But really, how do you all do powerful work because it is an integration of ideas and narrative and this very specific practice of abstraction. So how, and I open this up to everyone, but Holly, I was just talking about the work that you do in your COLA work of looking at communities, looking at abatement practices, looking at how we make signs literally in the streets, and then interpreting that language. And these are things, as June interprets the American flag, and I was also thinking about Adrian's piece that I included in the LA Blacksmith show of the flower of a woman's vagina, basically, and the power of that, completely abstracted, but at the same time knowable, self-referential, and a sort of statement about the power of Black womanhood. And so here we are in this moment of all of this performative kind of bullshit social justice happening, a lot of people saying things, or holding their hearts and saying, well, our founder was a racist, or this was that, or this, I didn't have any Black friends, blah blah blah. And yet they're really hoping that absolves them of making any real action. And so what I'm asking is that in the language of your practice, what kind of action, not that it's on you, as Isabelle said, it is not your burden, but in thinking about moving forward, how do you see the interpretation of your work, or the interpretation of your ideas and narratives, as being part of a larger conversation, moving things away from this superficial, from the facade of inclusion, into these really deep, meaningful ideas that you guys work on and through in what you do?
I'm wondering if Adrian, if you could talk a little bit about how that works within your work.
Which Adrian?
Adrian Culverson's, and then you too, Adrian Devine.
Sure. Kind of merging both questions together, I would say that I take usually all of my anger, and that goes into my work. I also like to play tennis too. That's also a good expression of anger. But abstraction for me has always been kind of like a freeway, like a permission slip where I can take everything that I'm thinking about and pile it in, if it's like a virtual way or a realistic way, and something comes out. That's just kind of how it works for me.
Well, for me, abstract is freedom. It's whatever you want it to be. And for me, it's sort of a shorthand to express ideas, hopes, dreams, to get it out in a gesture, or certain marks that independently of, in and of themselves don't have a particular meaning, but they have a lot of meaning to you. And in the context of the work, they begin to build a narrative, and make a story. When I'm working in particular, I can kind of liken it to jazz, really. It's abstraction is improvisational for me. So, and I know a lot of us listen to music as we're working, so it's sort of a perfect analogy. But, in jazz, you may have some bars, you have a specific melody, you may have the written notes, and that's how you start out. And then at some point in that set, it turns into improvisation. And the music begins to drive you versus you driving the music. And that's what happens for me with abstraction. It's, I think it's interesting the way, Jill, the way you posed that question, because you talk about, revolution and what it means. And for me, abstraction literally is freedom. So that's one of the ways I use it. And then when I think about the I guess the spiritual and the cultural foundations of my work, the frameworks that I work within, my work is really about, it's somewhat autobiographical, it's also historical, and it also calls on African spirituality and culture. And so I'm able to create these, what I'm doing, what I envision what I'm doing when I'm making my work is I'm really creating spaces where, where these creatives and freedom fighters are in community, spaces where my ancestors are waiting for me. And the work, it creates points of access to those places. And again, those are places of freedom. So it's abstract literally in how it appears on, the canvas, the sculpture, whatever, and it's also abstract in its conception. That's kind of how it works for me.
I want to interject briefly. We were going to take a little break at some point. Since people are asking questions about the artwork itself, I'm going to go ahead and screen share for a few minutes. I believe you can still keep talking. So I apologize. I wanted to find a good break in the conversation. I didn't want to interrupt anyone. So I'm going to go ahead and show the slides. You guys can keep right on talking.
I think that this idea of freedom is really interesting, and how we use abstraction to get free, right? To start sharing our ideas of what freedom looks like and feels like, more importantly. And I think that's something that I'd love to hear more about. June, if you could jump in and talk about the fact that so much of your work is about, yes, about these very historical events, but it's also about feeling. And that's one of the things that abstraction does, right? It connects us so deeply with this resonance of other people's pasts and histories and experiences. So can you just talk to us a little bit about how you literally paint that into your practice, these emotions and these feelings and this language of freedom?
Yeah, freedom is such a good term. I didn't start off as an abstract painter. You know, I started off as sort of an abstracting figurative painter. And in my figurative work, I always wanted to loosen the work up and loosen the work up and insert more freedom, if you will. The work for me has always been about color. It's always been about mark making. And so it had always been about color, and I always wanted it to be about mark making. And I just tried and tried and tried for the figurative to be more about that, until it just got to the point where it's like, get rid of the figure, you know, and make this about, you know, the color and the mark making. So the paintings are about that. And so the first time it was about that, I actually made it only about mark making and took away the color. So that was quite a few years ago, and then gradually put the color back and just experimented with very simple shapes. And then I would just say in the past few years, I have just found meaning in the shape that, more and more meaning in the shape that I was working with. You know, I've always been fascinated in the way abstraction communicates on a level that's beyond words, as jazz does, you know, as music does, as, you know, to use Adrian's analogy, it's like you're communicating super deeply, but without words, you know, when you compare even John Coltrane with or without, you know, Johnny Hartman, you know, so imagery is kind of part of the work now, but I'm most fascinated over sort of this mystery of how simply color and shape can communicate something.
June, to just kind of piggyback on that, one of the things that strikes me particularly in thinking about your flag paintings, and I think this resonates with some of the rest of you, is just in thinking about freedom, one of the things that you're challenging and you're pushing against is the idea of erasure and invisibility. And what would be interesting to hear from you and Sharon, because I think Sharon, you talked about invisibility, and to hear about how your work plays as a counterpoint to that.
Well, the flag is sort of blackened out, right? And a lot of people, when they view these works, upon their initial viewing, they don't even know it's a flag. So, and I'm glad, you know, I'm glad of that response. So, it's really reappropriating it. You know, the flag is imagery that's been used over and over again, over and over again. And, you know, it was just my way of reappropriating this thing that is supposed to represent this country that just never has or has struggled to, and it's just more of this dream to have this America that has been promised us. It's just what our dream has been as African Americans. So so it is the flag to me as as its initial representation, that we've always associated with some kind of erasure, okay? And so it to me, these flags is bringing into view, you know, who these flags are really supposed to represent, okay? And so Holly was saying something about the black square being sort of this erasure, and that really resonates as well. You know, just these works that I'm working on now, one particularly is sort of about a silence. And I think that silence sort of represents an assumed innocence that we were never able, you know, to have associated with us, you know, and navigating in this new time right now, where people are, like Jill said, holding their heart and saying, oh, we haven't done this and we want to now. But still, we're expected to assume innocence from whether it's institutions or even individuals, and sort of be silenced in that assumption.
Well, for me, I think in my work and all of our work, we're creating a way to speak, and we're putting symbols in that that speak to something. We're putting in textures, lines, gestures that all have some. We're speaking through the language of abstraction that way. And for instance, I put these ovals. They're actually dried paint, but I cut them into the shape of the oval, and that shape of the black body. And so in the midst of this abstraction, you may see these ovals and think, oh, they're just a motif that doesn't mean anything. But like the painting that's on the screen, To Rise Through These Flames Unburned, was about the trauma and the all of the violence that happens, and yet we rise through this, all of this that happens, and we still rise through this. And so I've been putting that oval into the work quite a bit to give that a visibility. I even embedded it in one of my black paintings, where it was based on Langston Hughes' Shadows Cut from Shade. And that black, even in the darkness, has a shining that comes through it to give life even in its darkness. So we're through abstraction, all of us are speaking things that to give voice to something that has been voiceless. And so I think back to Jill saying this is revolutionary art, because we're it's like coded messages in a way, you know, that we're getting out what we have to say through codes, you know, and people who can see it pick up on it. Oh, I see that. And if you want to come talk to us, we'll give you the whole thing. But, you know, June's one flag has a whole story in it, you know, so we'll tell you the in-depth, but we're giving you enough of the code to give voice to whatever idea that we're communicating, and whatever it may be, through texture, line, gesture, it's all in that abstraction. And it's one of the reasons, like June was saying, probably all of us worked in figuration before. And so why did we move beyond it?
Mm-hmm.
We all moved beyond it. That's a question I would like to ask all of us. I know for me, I moved beyond it. I had been working in collage for a long time, but I always put figures in it. But something was pushing me to, I don't want to be that obvious. I want you to get in this dig deep.
Mm-hmm.
I want something deep in here. You know, whether it's spiritual or political or social. I didn't want to just blam, here's a black body, buy it, take it home. You know, I mean, not that I want to put that down, because that's also important, to give dignity to the image of Black people. But we all wanted to do something else with that. And I think it is, back to what Jill was saying, it's very revolutionary to do it this way.
Yeah, I think what you're saying too about the Black body, and also dovetailing that with what Holly was saying about commodification, because it feels like in this time now, there's this race to commodify the Black body. So you see a lot of art, and again, this is not to discount that at all, but it's kind of like flavor of the day kind of thing. And abstract art has always been a bit, except for those who really, I guess, have been educated about it or informed with it, or just resonate with certain types of work. But it's particularly in the Black community, it's been a bit of an outlier. And I think part of that is because we wanted to see images of ourselves that were dignified versus a lot of the stereotypical stuff that we would see, and that didn't show our full humanity as just as, you know, people with families, with lives that are, you know, that are regular. And so for me, getting part of what Sharon, what you were saying too about code, that's one of the things that is so fascinating to me, or interesting to me, about African graphic symbols, because we were often taught that, you know, well, they don't have a, you know, there's no written language, so to speak, you know, everything is oral, but there's a lot of meaning in the graphic images, and they span all the things that you just named, you know, politics, relationships, and all of that. And so incorporating those symbols into the work, for me, is kind of reclaiming the languages that we spoke that were stolen, you know, basically erased from our memory. But there's something, I think, in our DNA, that when we see certain forms, and when something has been created from a, in the making of it, that it's kind of imbued with a certain amount of spirituality, which is another thing in academia, you know, spirituality and art, as whoa, you know, oh my God. I'm sorry, but you know, but it resonates with people, and and I find, at least with my work, it's not only Black people. Black people may be able to maybe read into it more than some people, and not always, but I find people of all walks of life will come up to me and tell me how much a piece resonates with them, and they don't know why, but it speaks to them.
I think that's the gift of abstraction. I think abstraction is a gift, because with abstraction, we are inviting viewers to come and spend time with the work and really investigate it, and to unwrap all of these layers, and to spend time with it, and to interpret all of these marks and lines and shapes, right? And whether our work is filled with lots of color, or like with mine, where I'm only using Black paint, it's interesting to observe people looking at abstraction. It's interesting to hear people's response, how they receive it, you know? I've seen people just in general walk into a space and move and be gravitated to, let's just say, representational work, because there are things that they immediately identify with, and pass over abstraction and not think twice about it, because, and I can't make any assumptions about any one particular person, but in things that I've heard, that for some, it takes too much time to try to figure out what's there, right? Or to spend time with it and to be moved by it. And that's why I think that it's a gift, right? That you're there and you're slowly unwrapping this work, you know? Isabelle talked about, Adrian talked about, and June talked about jazz. And I shared with them in the first conversation that we had that I had an experience with an older gentleman an older Black man actually, who knew I was in the show and didn't want to attend the show for a variety of reasons. Right. And he did not like abstraction. And because he was an older Black man of a certain age, I knew he would love jazz. And so I asked him if he liked jazz, and he said yes. And so I said, well, jazz is abstraction. You know, representational work is, you know, Isaac Hayes. I tried to find somebody who he'd know. You know, Isaac Hayes, turn off the lights and light the candle. That's representational work, right? You see what's happening in it. It's the storytelling. But with jazz, you have, and I don't have a musical background, but there's the syncopation, there's the harmony, there's whatever it is, right? All of these marks and movements and all of this color and shape and texture is all the jazz, right? And if you can feel Coltrane and Miles and Ornette Coleman and all this, allow yourself to spend time with the abstract work, because that's also jazz, right? That's abstraction, right? And that's where the codes are, right? That's where this innate information that we are processing and channeling into the work is, you know? I too, when I started with abstraction, it's funny, I came from figurative work through photography. That was my initial study. I dabbled in drawing or painting representational work for my own self, but I've always been interested in codes and DNA and language and inherited memory and information. And so my movement into abstraction really came from me thinking about intergenerational relationships and how things are inherited and what type of codes and invisible threads exist within all of us. And so I was thinking about codes as language when I started making the work that I was making earlier on. And I get so excited. I'm starting to lose my train of thought and where I was with the original question.
I have a quick question. I wanted to kind of go back a little bit because when you talk, I wanted to go a little bit back to talking about codes. Mm-hmm. And Sharon, one of the things that you had said was, you know, in reference to June's work, and I'm sure it applies to your work and all of your works, is ask us, like, our work is coded in a particular way. The question I have is how much I want to kind of know maybe each of you can speak to that. Like, I think it's so often the question is, well, what is your work about? And in response to that, or in hearing that, there's a need to kind of go through this history, because the work comes from that, you're pulling from the ancestors, you're pulling from these different narratives that are in your life. Do you really want to share that? Is that something is that a code you want to open up, or is that part of the language and the of it being kind of a conversation that is insular within for Black women, or for yourself, or for the Black community?
Well,
I can answer that.
Look at the sort of universal. I think there are some things that are universal that everyone can access, and I will say also that one of the things that I miss about being able to go out is I like to watch people look at my work and even other people's work. It's just fascinating to see how they respond. And that's one of the benefits of being there, because then you begin to have a conversation and you can talk about what they see in their work and what that means to them. and you can talk about maybe what your intent was in making that work. I don't see it so much as necessarily doing a what do you call it, a lexicon or of everything that you do. But I think it's a point where you're able to have a conversation with the viewer and sort of build a bridge so that you open up a conversation and you open up ideas for people. That's kind of how I look at it.
Oh, sorry.
So I was just going to say, so with my work, I incorporate imagery from urban graffiti, so which of course is heavily encoded visually and also in terms of content, and it's a way for people on the street, potentially members of the same gang or whatever, to communicate with one another, and also to threaten one another. So what's interesting to me is that a lot of those codes also replicate marks that you find in abstract painting, marks and gestures. So there's this kind of, I have a sort of I think of it as a demented sort of way of sort of this purposeful naivete as a painter, where I'm taking things that might be seen as ominous or as a threat or as dangerous or as urban blight, and transposing them into abstraction in a very formal way, and creating this sort of new kind of space where these different elements bump against each other, and that creates for me the emotional impact of the painting. As far as abstraction goes, I started pretty early. My first year of college, I was studying art and creative writing at Pitzer College in Claremont, and I went abstract pretty fast. I realized that it was the way my brain worked, that I love patterns, I love color, I love marks, I love gestures, and I like creating a sense of experience and space. So it made sense to me to do that. And I think, in the current context, I actually adopted the motto of paint or die because it felt like that some days, I have to tell you. I felt like I was losing my mind. I felt like terrified to go out of my house, because of this horror of the Rona, this terrible Rona. I felt like I needed to paint or I was going to go crazy. And again, that connection between finding my breath and finding my ability to get back in the studio. I think as a Black woman artist doing abstraction, I consider the revolution is happening for me every day that I'm in the studio working. It's an act of both defiance and celebration. Just being who I am and making my work, that's my job. Anything else we do is extra. And, I think looking at the screen today and admiring, all these women I've known now for many years, looking at the richness of the work. I mean, again, looking at it, trying not to get distracted how wonderful everybody's work is. When you look at our faces, look at us, look at how diverse we are. So I think that's the message I want to say to people, is that there is no monolithic Black culture. Hello. We represent the diaspora. I have ancestors that come from Senegal, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, but also Western and Northern Europe, and even Southeast Asia, for crying out loud. All of these things are in our DNA. And they come out in the work. And I think the other thing that's interesting to me about the idea of codes is, I immediately thought of the quilts that were hung on the fence to let slaves know it was safe, the
Right.
route to freedom, right? So it's interesting here we are in the 21st century. There's still people being oppressed. There's still actually modern day forms of slavery, if you think of things like trafficking. There are lynchings. There are terrible things happening to all kinds of people, and yet somehow we manage to persevere and to make work. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that. I just want to celebrate my sisters here in our conversation.
Yay!
So I'm going to just jump in for 1 second. It's 2:20, and I was just about to call on Betsy because we do have a handful of questions that Betsy's going to ask, but I'm just going to take the liberty to ask the first question, and then she can continue. There's one, since we're talking about codes.
Looks like Jill might have something she wanted to say.
Say.
You
Sorry.
can do the questions.
That and it sort of relates to somebody's question in the queue, but that for me as a curator and as a gallerist, it's been wonderful to look through these images and see work that I've shown. I will not take offense that people remove the gray from my gallery walls, but you know, the amount of work that I have had some relationship to and you know, honor to show is really incredible for me to have looked through that grouping of work and smiling at work that I, you know, pulled out of your studios and extended as an offering to the Los Angeles community and beyond. And I think that one of the things that I feel really proud about is that nobody has really mentioned, you know, I didn't have this gallery, or this gallery has not, you know, represented me or whatever, that you all come to this, as Holly said, you know, paint or die from a place that
Oh, yes.
deeply within you as makers. You know, this is the work that you must do. This is the work that this is the way that you communicate with the world. And whether or not you're represented by galleries is clearly inconsequential to this conversation, but people have asked, you know, well, where is the representation? I think that it's there, and it is in the work that you guys all do, despite whether or not some gallery has, you know, made you the flavor of the day. And I think that that's really, really beautiful, and that you'll keep at it. And that everybody is doing this powerful work, not to commodify, but to express themselves. So you guys, Lisa, go ahead and start your
Well,
next.
just kind of in response to what you said real fast, I don't know any other way to be. It's making this work, making work is like breathing. It's a part of my living. Would I love to be represented by a gallery? Heck yes, right? But the reality is I have to keep making. There are too many images that I see in my mind's eye. There are too many stories that I need to tell, right? And yeah, I don't, you know, when we had our first conversation, I mentioned, I was like, listen, what if for one of us or some of us, our reality is very similar to Carmen Herrera, the Cuban-American artist who didn't get recognition until she was 90. Like, that's 40 years away from me. What if that's my reality? I have to, how do I sit with that? I have to be at peace with the fact that that could be a part of my reality. Do I want that? No, but I'm not making work to be famous, and I'm not making work because I think it's a particular status. I'm making work because this is what has been put in me and is a natural part of me living. I've been making work since I was a kid in elementary school. I said it once in an interview. I have a clear memory of attending Wilton Place Elementary School, and all of the kids would be outside during recess, and I would be inside because I asked for a few cardboard boxes, and I was cutting them up, making dollhouses. Or I was making something else, right? Little did I know I was making skull. I didn't even know the word artist, but I knew that that was my inclination. Like, that was natural. I needed that. I didn't want to go outside and play. So,
but you know, Lisa, I think that as artists, I mean, don't we have a right to be able to make a living?
yeah. Oh, heck yeah. And I'm not
I mean,
saying
really, I mean,
right.
seriously, because that's the thing that when I look at the path that so many Black artists have taken who were phenomenal artists way before me, you know, all of a sudden you discover them when they're 80 or something. I mean, they were making great work at 40.
Yes.
And so why can't people make a living at what they do? I want to question the system. I need to question the system that shuts so many people out. and
I
decide
totally
and
agree with you,
cherry
but I
pick who gets to, okay, you now, you get to
So
have
I
a
think that
dollar.
opens up the question to quite a few things, right? So I want to be very clear about what I'm saying. I'm
Yeah.
saying that I didn't decide to be an artist because I'm trying to be famous and I'm making specific work.
Right.
Like, you put blue here and a frog here because I know that somebody's going to like this over their sofa, right? I'm making it because this is who I am. Do I want to live my life and earn a living based on what I do and live well? Heck yes.
Yeah.
That is, I believe that's all of us, for all of us, what we do. But the reality is that some of us are teaching, one, because we love teaching, but also it's providing a salary. So there are artists that are in a whole bunch of a variety of fields because they're not currently able to live off of the income by making and selling their work, right? So from what I've come to understand in this time that I've been an artist, that it's equally about, or maybe I don't know if it's equally, but that there's a part of it that's the making. There's a part of it that's establishing relationships. A lot of this seems to be about relationships, right? Who you know, right? Going places and being seen and meeting people, because then you're on the radar. And I'm not saying that that's a negative thing. I'm saying, you know, if there is a Mr. Fleming who's making work and he's making work in his garage and his paintings are outstanding, but no one knows he exists, those paintings will not be shown until he dies and somebody happens to find them in storage or somewhere. Right? So there are all these relationships and levels and various ways of folks needing to find us to show the works. And then there are, I mean, let's keep it real. Then there are people who know us who don't include us in stuff. And that's part of it as well. Like, you know, yeah, I think it's complex and multi-layered. But I totally agree with you, Sharon, that we all deserve and should be able to make a living doing what we love.
And I wasn't even really in talking about us personally. I'm just looking at, when I look at, I mean, if I were to list all of the Black artists who work in abstraction over the last, since say 1955, and at what point were they making a solid living out of what they did? And and of course we're going to keep, I mean, we're all making our work. We have made our work for decades, no matter what happened. Whether we got a single penny from it, we kept working because we're artists, and it's what we do. It's our breath. It's what we do to live and express ourselves as human beings. It's a sacred place for us. And we can't stop it because we would deny our own souls if we were to do that. But I think we have to question a system and encourage the system to change and to be more equitable towards people's art who come from communities of color. And I just think, and it's not just, you know, because it's trending right now. I mean, let's just be fair about it, you know, and give more opportunities to people who are doing good work and deserve to be seen.
But that isn't the way the gallery system works.
Right. I know.
Okay, I just want to interject. We are almost at the 2:30 mark. I'm happy to go a little bit longer. This conversation is amazing, but I just want you guys to know where you are in time. So go
And
right
there are
ahead.
questions. I know. I see that there are like 12 questions.
I'm down.
So Jill, did you want to say one more thing before we finish up?
I don't, you know, if we're going to call for change and revolution and equity and, you know, all of these things that are happening in this moment, you have to understand both that it's very difficult to have all of something, right? You can't say, I mean, it is difficult to say we demand inclusion, and that means that it has to, you know, art galleries that are all about commodification, a system that is not equal, that has never been based on equality, that has always been based on exploitation of people's labor, is somehow suddenly going to be benevolent. It doesn't work that way. And so if, you know, the revolution is in some ways, yes, everybody has to make a living unless you're a trust funder or whatever, or you're very successful at exploiting other people's labor. But, you know, to work in different kinds of community opportunities, to work in ways that are counter to capitalism, and getting the work out there and letting people interact with it and become literate in it and do these things requires, in some ways, a rejection of the very system that cannot change in the way that you want it to support your particular efforts. You know, there are plenty of Black people and artists, all, you know, of all colors and creeds, who toil away that you don't know because they were not necessarily discovered. But that doesn't mean that the community impact they may have had has been zero. It doesn't mean that the way that they may have influenced and inspired their children or their students or whoever isn't incredibly necessary for us to reach a level of understanding in this world. And so, you know, if you want to be a capitalist, be a capitalist. If you want your work to sell and you want gallery representation and you want to be an art star, that's very different. That's a very different conversation. And so what I had said was, I love the fact that nobody brought that up, that nobody brought up this sort of insistence that their work be included in particular ways that have historically denied women, Black people, people of color, Indigenous people, and based on a system that is unequal and unjust and frankly brutal. And so if you want to be in that brutality, that's not a conversation that I can have. I mean, which is why I closed my gallery, right? I cannot talk out of both sides of my mouth. I cannot talk about supporting artists and, you know, literally bloodletting for them, and at the same time feeling like I can negotiate with really rich people who want to nickel and dime me to death about selling their work. And so, you know, this is a different conversation, and I don't want to really, we can jump into the questions, but I just want to say that what you sell is not, your worth is not indicative by what you sell. It is about the power of the language that you create. And that's why I wanted to be part of this group and talk about this work that you're doing, not because you have a gallery or don't have a gallery, or not because, you know, you're a COLA fellow or not a COLA fellow, but because I find the work speaks to me and I can help other people relate to it in the work that I do. So that long-winded, go ahead to the question.
I wanted to say something really quick before we get to the questions. I also want to just point out, and this is something I've been harping on this now for a couple of years. I'm going to harp one more time. For those of you who are watching this, you're witnessing a group of very talented artists. We're a cohort, and we're a movement of sorts. So it's no different what we're doing as a group of artists working in proximity to one another, having conversations, influencing each other, supporting one another. It's no different than artists working in 1980s East Village, New York, or 19th century Montmartre, Paris, and you could name a million places around the world. What we're doing is valuable in this context and the context of art history. And I'd like to challenge people who are watching this that you really need to have a show of this work. Have the show, show us in the context, have us have these conversations. Again, talk is cheap. Don't tell us what you want to do. Don't show me any more black squares. Put us in a show. Create the context that we have created for ourselves.
Thank you, Holly. As we transition into looking at the questions, I think one of the points that I'll make is that one of the benefits I find of not being attached to the commercial gallery and not having to deal with foundations and funders is not having to have that pressure from the commercial world to do something at the gallery, at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery. And in my tenure there, really trying to increase and expand the voices of women and women of color in conversations that we have through the programming. And it is about doing the work. It is about showing up, and it's not easy. And I agree, Holly, it is much easier to say something than to actually go ahead and do it. And I've learned that over the short time. I've learned that in a different way over the time that I've been at LeMag. I think that we're in a moment where it is show up, or and it's either show up and do it or move out of the way. And so it will be interesting as galleries and museums really are able to reopen in a meaningful way and gather in a safe way, to see what happens. This is the planning time. This is the time for things to gestate. This is the time for things to emerge. This is the time for us to go deep, because most of the museums are closed. And for people who are on the admin side, this is the time for you to walk your staff through these questions and to really be able to come to a meaningful place, and not a place that isn't one show, but a place that allows for this conversation to emerge through all of the programming that you do and through all of the ideas that you bring forth. This isn't a one-off. This is a day-to-day. This is an everyday, every month, every year thing. And I think that's part of what the ladies here are saying. And if it is a one-off for you, you've missed the boat. You have missed the boat completely. And it's hard work. And if you think it's easy, you've also missed the boat. And if you don't go deep, you've missed the boat. If you don't understand how hard it is for these ladies to make the work that they do in the context that they're in the context that they're living, you've missed the boat. And if you say, oh, I get it, you don't get it. So this is a moment to really go deep and breathe through it, and breathe, because we're all breathing through this moment. And I say that because that's the work I'm trying to do with the staff that I work with. And that's the work that every director should be doing, whether you think you got it or not. It is time to do that. And so with that, we can, let's kind of go through some of we won't be able to get to all the questions. So it'll be a bit of a pick and choose, and maybe there'll be another moment for us to kind of go through that. I'll start with, let's see. I'll start with Gilbert. Gilbert asked sort of a long question, but one of the things that I guess he's asking is that there are African American curators working in museums. Sort of, how are you artists connected with them? And if you're not and are you able to interact with them? And I guess part of it is like, why is that not the case? And there is a preface behind that, but I just wanted to get to the question part of it. If anyone wants.
One of the, I mean, there's multiple reasons, but I think one of the things is that in order to have access to those kind of opportunities, you need to have, sometimes graduated from a particular school. And those people who come out of those schools are sort of, like get first dibs, or are considered the cream of the crop. And they particularly scout that out. So that's that's just one thing.
Who is they?
As far as, they? Well, in terms of the question about having connections and being shown in museums and so forth. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I think that you're right, that there is a sort of hierarchy that
thank you. That's the word I needed.
Look to, if you came out of Yale, then you're going to be a superstar. There's some weird, unexplained to me relationship between that graduate program and suddenly finding yourself getting solo exhibitions in museums, stepping
off the bat,
Which,
good for whoever can do that, but
well, sure, but the other thing is that there aren't a lot of Black curators in Los Angeles, actually, working with museums, and that's also a huge issue.
Mhm.
And I'm guessing,
I would say it's also, you know, it's as much the curators as it is sort of like the staff that's all the way going, you know, it's all the way through, and really seeing that from the educators who are interpreting the work to the handlers who are handling the work to the entrance, the front of staff. It's like, how do we show up in all of our, how do we show up, we as Black women, or how do we as people of color show up in those institutions?
Mhm.
I just want to say, I mean, I'm working right now on a Getty show, a photography show that, you know, when in my 2-year relationship with the Getty, you know, this opportunity came up, probably because of George Floyd, but also because the program that I normally do couldn't happen because of COVID. And, you know, I took this moment to say, how many artists could I fit in here?
Mm.
You know, and it can't be, you know, as I watch people cringe, you know, I'm like, I'm getting it in, because this may be my opportunity to do this and to show these people that I think are important and foundational to conversations in Los Angeles about identity and representation and about extending photography as a medium. And so I'm just going to shove as many, I mean, not in a, you know, if you know the kind of work that I do, you know that I just don't shove people in. I'm going to do as much work as I can and making as much space as I can, because who knows when the Getty will want to do this work again. And I think that that has been the way that I've approached my relationship to museums and institutions since I got here. And sadly, there isn't a big community of people really elbowing their way into places and demanding, you know, to fit as many people as they can in those places. There's just not.
well, another issue is, you know, how many of those museums have people of color in director positions, in management, on the board, as donors, as funders, not nearly as many as need to be. So I think that's a huge issue as well. And what I think too is that it sort of becomes a thing with where there's certain artists that I call them the usual suspects. And, you know, anybody who can do what they do and be successful, more power to you, because God knows we're all trying to do our thing. But it just becomes a certain handful of artists that you keep seeing again and again and again. So I really appreciate what you're saying, Jill, about trying to include a variety of worthy artists in a insightful and creative way at an institution like the Getty, which strangely enough does have kind of an interesting collection of, if I'm recalling correctly, of Black photography, because I know I went there with the Bila group a couple years ago. So want to just call that out, at least in terms of them making some kind of an effort to document what's happening in this community. But yeah, I think, you know, it goes from top to bottom and bottom to top. And oftentimes you'll find people of colors maybe in mid-management positions going down to, you know, the janitor, right? As opposed to being in the board, being the director of the museum, you know, being major power players. And that has to happen a lot more.
I think another thing that's happening, though, is that artists are taking matters into their own hands. And I think that ultimately that's the solution, not trying to fit into a system that was not designed to accommodate you, and perhaps doesn't value what you do and what you have to say. You know, it's really incumbent on us. And that's why one of the reasons why I appreciate this conversation is that we have to inform and educate each other. Because there's been a lot of erasure, there's a lot of what we don't know about ourselves, and to avoid any distractions or sabotage to our efforts to collectively do what we need to do.
And that also makes me think of the reality of what people who do achieve a certain level professionally, speaking specifically about people of color, what one has to endure in those environments, you know, the microaggressions, the blatant racism. I mean, without naming any names, I walked away from a full-time teaching position in Los Angeles because I had enough. Couldn't take it anymore and needed to get out of there for my own sanity and well-being, and thank God I did. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy financially. It wasn't easy professionally. I lasted as long as I could, and now there's people coming behind me, and of course now with what's going with COVID, we don't know what's going to happen with education since it's moved online for the moment. But there are a lot of people like myself, academics, museum directors, curators, you name it, who are tired of being treated poorly, of being ignored, of dealing with exclusion, disrespect. So that has to change as well.
Amen.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to say too is that I think that in this moment, as opportunities are, coming our way, that it's very important to really vet what it is that's being presented to you, to be sure that it's not just surface, that it's something that is sustainable, and that that you're not just an afterthought and being approached as an afterthought, and hoping that basically you're there to be the token black to co-sign on somebody's institutional relevance. So it's like you say, there's a race for commodification and people doing stuff to feel good, or some institutions where good and well that they didn't mean what was written about them. There are others who are making really some sincere efforts, and people are going to make missteps. We all do. But I really think it's incumbent on us to really be careful about who we decide to align with and lend our faces, our names, our time, and our energy and our spirit to. Because
Adrian, I think you're so right, and I think they're important questions that artists, that Black artists can ask in finding out more about the institutions and their relationships, and what is the work that they're doing on the inside, so that you're getting into something that is coming from the inside out, not the outside in, where you become the color for an institution that doesn't have any deeper thoughts behind how they want to engage communities of color. I think particularly as we look at, we can look at what happened in East LA with the different galleries moving in. We're experiencing that in South LA, where people have bought property. Maybe it was very cheap after the rebellions of in the 90s. And they bought property and they've turned those properties into galleries, and we got to really, there are lots of things that are shifting right now, and I think there are critical questions you can ask, and I say that because those are questions that should be asked, because if it is a topical cream that someone is trying to apply to a situation, you know exactly what you're getting into, and then that's your choice. Because I think that's a choice that you're making, and you know exactly what you're getting into. But I also think that one of the things that strikes me is really looking at how your work will be interpreted, and what is the interpretation of the work that will be presented to the public. Will your work always be turned on? Will the lighting of your work be the way that you want it to be, to have it seen in the right way? Those are subtle but very important cues for you to know. And I mean, turned on, it's like there are lots of different ways that can go, but I think those are important conversations for you to have as you move forward with institutions who all should be calling you and wanting to show work as we get to that point of re-entry. So I know we're coming to 2:50 and we have sailed right past 2:30. It feels like this is a conversation that could probably go on for maybe another hour. So maybe there'll be a part 2. But I want to also just, you know, be aware of all of where we are, the time frame. And Betsy, do you want to jump in?
I just want to say we do have several really great questions. I think just in the interest of time and everybody's energy in front of the screen, it might be nice to address those in a follow-up email. So if you guys aren't opposed to that, I think if you could maybe come up with some parting words now. Some people have signed off already, but it's such a great conversation. I feel like in some ways we've barely scratched the surface. So we may have to do this again. I feel so grateful. So I will turn it back to you and you can wrap up however you see fit. And then we can follow up with answers to the questions maybe afterwards in an email.
Thank you, Betsy. Well, one thing that I will say is, first of all, just everyone, it's been amazing to see the number of people that are here, and I'm reading through the questions, and you know, the conversation is just so rich that we weren't able to get to all of them, but I think that it's a great idea to email a response. But I want, before everyone else goes, I want you to all know that this conversation, Conversations About Abstraction, will continue with other artists. I think that part 2 with the artists that are here is definitely a possibility, and it should happen, and I don't see why not. But I want you to know that Conversations About Abstraction will continue with artists that are working in sculpture, performance, in other forms. So if you'd like to be put on a mailing list, there is an email address, conversationsaboutabstraction@gmail. And excuse me, I live in a noisy neighborhood, so if you hear all of this, forgive me. So it is conversationsaboutabstraction@gmail.com, and I will add you to the list and inform you of future conversations and who they'll be, what institutions are interested in hosting, and who those moderators will be. And again, just from me, thank you guys so much to all the panelists for being here and for all of you participating as attendees. And I'll hand it off to the rest of you.
I guess, should I go next? I just want to thank my fellow panelists. You know, you all know I love you. You're fantastic. I feel very privileged and touched to be part of this with you ladies. And I want to thank those people that tuned in and who, you know, are paying attention and who want to learn and who want to educate. And we appreciate your support very much. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for coming up with the idea and for inviting all of us, and myself included. Thank you to the participants, and this is wonderful. I can't wait to see what happens.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lisa, for putting this together so much. This is amazing, the series, all of this. Thank you to the other artists. It's such an honor to be in this square box with you today. Thank you, Jill and Isabelle. You guys' contributions are just so needed and so appreciated. Thank you, Betsy, for having us.
I want to just say thank you as well to, well, you know, I love all of you guys, and guys, I got to get that word out of my vocabulary, but you know, I love all of you, and how important the camaraderie of artists is. It's just vital for us to be able to love and support one another. It's one of the reasons that has kept me continually creating without being discouraged, is because of the love of my sisters in art. And I appreciate that very much. And thank you, Isabelle and Jill, so much for all the work that you do. I've told you, Jill, before that it's important work, and it's valuable. And I wish there were more people like the two of you.
Thanks.
I'd say ditto all that gratitude, and especially to the people that tuned in. I think that's just amazing that so many people care and listen. And if anything, I think what's important is part of what we're doing right here is really documenting our presence and what we do, and part of what I do, and that I won't say I follow along in the steps of Samela Lewis, because those are some huge shoes to fill. But in terms of knowing, highlighting, revering, and educating about Black artists, I think that's part of my little mission within my work, is to, in whatever small way I can do that, I like to do that. And I think it's important that we seek that out and do it and educate in whatever way we can, so that we know who we all are and what we're all doing.
Yeah.
So thank you guys all. Thank you, ladies, women, powerful women, for the conversation and for allowing me to show your work and work with you and write about your work, and also to take your work into the communities where I think it matters most.
Thank you all. I thank you, Jill, for, we had some really great conversations prior to this, and thank you, Betsy and Flux Space for hosting this, and thank you to all the artists for this conversation. I'm very grateful to be part of this, and look forward to more conversations like this. Thank you.
I look forward to answering the questions too. And hearing about everybody else. There's really good questions in there, so yeah.
Are we gonna get everybody a copy of the questions?
Okay, so anything else before we sign off?
I think that is it. Wonderful. It's been great.
That's it.
So much.
Thank
And
you.
for anybody who lives in Long Beach, Adrian Devine will have her work in the window at Flux in August. So please feel free to stop by. So thank you, everyone. I actually have some ideas about spaces to show of your work. So I'll talk to Jill and Isabelle. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Guys.